Hi YouTube, Charlie Black 20 back once again with another movie review. I promised this one earlier, here it is. Free Willy 2, The Adventure Home. The movie starts very similar to the original with us seeing a pod of orcas, which we know will include Willy this time. And we see them playing in the ocean, jumping, spy hopping, which is when they stick their heads up like this. And we see this boat that is called Natslane. And who's driving it but Randolph? And he is helped by his goddaughter Nadine in using the boat, and they are recording the sounds the orcas are making. Randolph goes down, listens to the sounds, hears one he finds very familiar, and we cut over to Jesse and Glenn at their house working, where Glenn is teaching Jesse how to use their small boat. And Jesse's really distracted, and he's picking up the binoculars and he's looking around Glenn, and Glenn's like, "What are you looking at?" Jesse's like, "Nothing." And then, of course, Jesse jumps out of the boat, runs down the street, and Glenn turns, and of course, it's a bunch of girls. We learned that Jesse, Glenn, and Annie are going to be taking a trip to a place called, I believe it was Puget Sound. They're going to see Randolph and hopefully some orcas. And when Jesse comes back, we see that Glenn and Annie have welcomed in their home Dwight from the original movie, who was Jesse's caseworker, basically. And he's come with some news. And Glenn and Annie sit Jesse down and they tell him, "We found your mother. She was in New York City, but she has passed away." And this is where I think they make a big mistake, is that they've hit Jesse with this news that his mom is gone, completely gone. She never came for him, she was never coming for him, but that she left somebody behind. She left a young boy, an 8-year-old named Elvis. That is Jesse's half-brother, different father. And Jesse storms out of the house saying, "I don't want a brother, I want my mom." And he just busts out, grabs his bike, heads over to the pier at this abandoned place, and he starts kicking the wooden posts, throwing sticks at the seagulls. And Glenn has followed him and just talks to him, just says, "Hey, yeah, this sucks. Elvis is going to be staying with us for a little while because it's called kinship care, meaning that you're his closest family member, your last remaining family member, and so he's going to stay with you, and basically we're going to keep him for a couple of weeks while they try to figure something out for him." And Jesse's like, "Yeah, until Annie decides to adopt him and we're stuck with him forever." And Glenn's like, "Yeah, pretty much." And they decide they're still going to go on their trip. And but Elvis does come that night with Dwight, and he's nowhere near as rude as Jesse was to them. But he's saying really stupid stuff like, "I can only stay with families who are rich," or "I'm used to rich families," blah, blah, blah. And it becomes a theme throughout the movie about how Elvis really just tells these outrageous lies, like his father being Al Pacino, how he's gone bungee jumping, how he doesn't sleep at all, things like that. And so next morning they head out to Puget Sound for their trip. And we see how Jesse and Elvis just aren't really getting along that well. To their misfortune, Elvis and Jesse are kind of stuck together on the boat. But they do see these orcas. They see, although Jesse does make a joke, when he says that there's going to be an orca spotting station instead of an amusement park. And Elvis is like, "You mean where they paint spots on whales?" And Jesse's like, "Exactly." And then they see this orca that's surfing the waves, basically, of the boat. And everybody's like, "That's so cool." Even Elvis is like, "Wow, that's pretty cool." So they get to the campground, and then Randolph shows up and honks the horn. Jesse comes running, gives him a big hug. Glenn and Annie are glad to see him. Elvis tries to say that he was part Apache because Randolph says he's Haida, but that Haida is the sworn enemy, that the Apache are the sworn enemy of my people. And Elvis says, "Oh, did I say Apache? I meant Comanche." And Randolph's like, "That's even worse." And Jesse and Randolph head out. And Randolph gives Jesse, he says, "I have 2 surprises for you." He gives him one of them right away, which is a necklace with a carving of a orca on it. And he says, "This came from the people of my village. They say that when you have it near your heart, the orca becomes part of your soul, and you are connected to him forever." And they get to the dock where the Natslane boat is, and Nadine is getting everything ready, and Jesse puts his foot in his mouth where he says, "I hope she's the second surprise," and Randolph's like, "I'll ignore that." And Jesse just keeps staring at her like, and Randolph gives him the binoculars to look for orcas, but Jesse just goes right to Nadine, and Randolph goes, and Jesse's like, "What?" And Randall's like, "Listen, she's my goddaughter. She's like a daughter to me. Come on." And so Jesse kind of calmed down a little bit. And Randolph calls Nadine up to introduce her. This is Jesse, Nadine. And Randolph takes Jesse down below the deck, and he has him listen to the sounds that he recorded. And immediately Jesse's like, that's Willy. And Randolph's like, "I didn't want to tell you till we were sure." So they head out to find where the orcas are, and Randolph's like, "They're probably having lunch. We're going to go find them." They do, and they just see them all over the place. It is called J-Pod, and Willy sees he says that there's one of them that has a mark on their dorsal, a white patch in the shape of a moon. That's Willy's sister, Luna. And the little calf that's swimming beside Luna is Little Spot, because he's got a little tiny spot under his chin. He's a little calf. He's very, very young, which is Willy's half brother. And there's an extraordinarily big orca that Jesse spots, and Randolph says, "That's Catspaw, Willy's mother." And Jesse's like, "He found her." And then, of course, who else do we see but Willy? And the way Jesse recognizes him, like we all do, is because of his humongous dorsal that's supposed to be standing straight up is completely curved over. So it's like, "That's Willy! That's Willy!" And unfortunately, they do have to end the trip right then, in the orca spotting trip at that moment, because they have to go back in so the orcas can go and hunt. And Jesse goes to Glenn and says, "We saw him for just a second, but it's him. Do you think he misses me?" And Glenn's like, "I know he does." And that night, Elvis is getting on Jesse's nerves because he's saying other lies like, "Oh, I can't sleep because of my back. I need an extra pillow." And Jesse puts an invisible line down the tent saying, "If you cross over here, you're dead." And of course, Elvis does the kid thing where he's like, "Oh, is this over? Is this over? Is this over?" And finally, Jesse just gets fed up and says, "Screw you," basically, and walks out of the tent and goes by the dock to just sit down, and he starts playing his harmonica. The harmonica he used to play at the aquarium. He still has it. And he's kind of ruminating. He's obviously thinking about his mom and how annoying Elvis is. And he puts the harmonica in his pocket, or at least he thinks he does, because it falls and it hits the water and sinks. And Jesse's like, "Great, just great." And we see it sinking. And then, boom! Guess who comes out of the water but Willy? And Jesse's like, "Wow, boy, look at you, you're huge." And Willy opens his mouth. And in his mouth is the harmonica. He obviously heard the harmonica and came running. So they're reunited, and Jesse's talking to him like, "I'm so glad you found your mom. I can hear her right now. She's singing for you. And my mom died too. My mom died. She never found me." I miss her a lot. I feel like I'm alone. And he's really glad to see Willy, but he's also kind of dealing with the fact that his mom's gone. So he tells Willy, listen, your mom's calling you, you better go. And the next morning, Jesse's up bright and early at dawn, wakes up Glenn and Annie, who are trying to sleep, and he says, we need to go, Randolph's waiting for us. And they're like, listen, we're going to sleep in a little while. Take Elvis with you. And he's like, he brings Elvis along. But when they get there, Nadine is leaving, and obviously the chemistry between Jesse and Nadine is very clear to Elvis, as well as us, the audience. And he says, you're a traitor. What? Girls are the enemy. No, you are the enemy. And Jesse goes over to Randolph, and Randolph is working on the engine, that there's something wrong with it, and he says it's going to take him a couple hours. And Jesse looks up, and he's watching Nadine walking away, and he's like, okay, see you in a couple hours. And so Jesse tells Elvis to go away, go back to the campsite. Obviously, Elvis doesn't do that. He follows Jesse without Jesse knowing. And Jesse follows Nadine, and she goes to this cove where we see Little Spot and Willy and Luna have come to the cove, and they're just kind of playing around a little bit. And when Jesse sees this, he accidentally slips on some rocks, and he lands in the water at the bottom of this kind of not a cliff, but like a really, really steep hill. And Nadine hears him and kind of confronts him like, you were following me. And he's like, so? And she explains that this is her favorite spot in the world, that this cove is special because the orcas come and rub themselves on the bottom because the rocks are so smooth, and it's called rubbing rocks. And Jesse starts playing his harmonica to try and impress Nadine, not with the music, but with how the orcas start responding to it, going, ah, ah. And this does impress her a little bit, and he's like, okay, now we're going to get really close. Jesse's trying to get Willy to come up, and Willy does, kind of scaring him, and he starts petting him and saying, hey, you need to help me out. Little Spot comes up, and Jesse tries to pet him, but he just goes straight back under the water. He's a lot more shy. And he tries to convince Nadine to pet Willy, and she's about to, and then Willy goes under, comes up, and spits water all over them. And Jesse's like, how can you do this to me, Betty? How can you do this to me? Come on. And he starts splashing at Willy, and Little Spot does the same thing, comes up and spits at them. And Jesse's like, what a great friend. And then he says that Willy's showing off, and then Willy comes right past him and does with his blowhole and blows the hat off of Jesse's head. And Jesse's like, I gotta get it. It's in the water. Gotta go get it. He dives in, grabs his hat, and Willy takes him for a ride. And Nadine is flabbergasted at this. Like, she can't believe what she's seeing. But obviously, Willy, he's used to this. And so they just go for a good ride, and it's fun. And Nadine is extremely impressed. Elvis can't believe his eyes because he's been spying on them all. And so he goes down to that same spot, and he plays his harmonica, nowhere near as well. And then Little Spot comes up and spits on him. And Elvis gets kind of scared and runs away. And we head back to the campsite where Glenn and Annie are cooking some food. And Nadine and Jesse are watching the cove through the binoculars. They're just like looking through it. And they see this oil tanker come through. And it's obvious that Nadine doesn't like it. She says they treat it like it's their own private highway. This cove should be protected. And Elvis, when she turns her binoculars to Elvis, he does this. Yeah. And he tells a very big lie at that moment to Anne and Glenn, where he says, I saw Jesse kissing Nadine. And both Glenn and Annie do this over at Jesse and Nadine. And he goes over, introduces himself, says he needs to talk to Jesse. And they start... Jesse has no idea what Glenn's talking about, because Glenn's talking about how things that Jesse's been doing could lead to sex. And Jesse's really confused at this moment. He's like, what are you talking about? And Glenn clarifies, I'm talking about you kissing Nadine. And Jesse says, I didn't kiss Nadine. Who said that? And Glenn says, I'll give you 3 guesses. And so he confronts Elvis, puts him in the tent, basically, grounds him. And the next scene is Jesse and Nadine have gone back to the cove of the rubbing rocks, where they are have masks, they've got swimsuits, and they dive under the water, where they hang out with mostly Willy. They mostly swim around Willy, and he gives them a ride, and Jesse and Nadine start holding hands. And even Luna participates a little bit, where she's swimming next to Nadine. And Little Spot, he gets into his own little trouble when Elvis shows up there. And he brings Little Spot come up by playing the harmonica again, and Little Spot again spits on him. But this time Elvis has a water gun, and he starts squirting him back, saying, "Tough guy, come on, fight like a fish." He keeps calling them fish. So at that after that, when the swimming session is over, Jesse and Nadine have a moment where they do kiss. That night, Jesse, Elvis, everybody's asleep, and we see this same oil tanker that was passing through. They are running late, and their captain says, "The reason I'm captain is because I'm never late." And he tells them to maintain their speed, even though they're being told to reduce speed by like the weather reports and traffic control and all that stuff. And something happens to the engine to make it go kerblooey, basically. And the captain realizes that they're on the wrong side of the buoy where they see the flashing light. They're on the wrong side of it, which means that they're getting closer to shore, and they're in danger of hitting the ocean bottom. And so they try to turn, but they can't get it to turn. And they do run aground, and this oil tanker starts spilling out crude oil. And as we all know, that is horrible. Absolutely horrible. And then we see Luna swimming through the crude oil as it's coming out of the ship. The next morning, when Jesse, he hears something that makes him wake up, and he recognizes the sound. It's an orca in distress, and then he hears Willy's cry of distress from the original movie. And he heads down to the beach, and Elvis follows him. And they get there, and they see that Luna has been beached. She's beached herself. And Jesse sends Elvis back to Glenn and Annie to get them to call Randolph. At first, they don't believe him, but then they hear the orcas, and they call Randolph. And Randolph gets there. He does a test. He gets a sample of Luna's breath from her lungs through the blowhole. He holds up kind of like a petri dish looking thing, and she up into it. He covers it. He takes a cloth of some kind and swirls it right around her blowhole, partly to clean it, but also to get a sample. And he says, she's probably got oil in her lungs. We need to get this to the lab immediately. Tell them it's an emergency, and from me. And so they all push Luna back into the water with everything they've got. And she does go back in the water, but she doesn't swim away. She's barely floating there. So she's not in good shape. Because of everything that's going on, you get these protests you get a protest going on when this, the guy who's running, like, I guess the PR for the oil company that ran aground. And there's a big protest about how they're destroying the environment. They're killing these whales. And he gets there to try and do damage control, basically. At the same time, Randolph has called in some help from a couple doctors, a couple veterinarians, I guess, who specialize in whales, I guess. And her name is Kate, and she gets there with antibiotics to help treat Luna. And Jesse mentions to Randolph, Willy doesn't like doctors. And Little Spot and Willy are circling around Luna. when the doctor and her assistants try to give Luna some antibiotics. With Willy, he hits their boat, their little speedboat, and forces them away. It's like a speed raft, I guess, and forces them away from Luna. And so the oil guy and Kate convince Jesse that he needs to help them because he's Willy's only friend at this moment. And he says, I'll make a deal with you, as to the oil guy. Oh, I'm sorry. Elvis storms away when they kind of ignore him being friends with Little Spot. He gets mad about that, and he follows him. And makes a deal with Elvis that she will listen to him and take him seriously about wanting to help. And they do a spit shake. But Jesse and the oil guy make a deal. Jesse will convince Willy to let them help Luna, but he has to promise that he will get Willy, Luna, and Little Spot back to their mom, or that he has to try. And so he does promise that. Jesse gets a huge salmon, which was Willy's chocolate. And he tries to get Willy to come to him on this little floating wooden dock. And Willy does come to him, but at first he rams the dock. And Willy's not really listening at that moment. And finally Jesse gets him to calm down and say, they're here to help, I want to help. And he gives Willy the chocolate, the salmon. And Willy finally does allow them to help Luna. And they give her an injection. And they're all kind of celebrating. And the oil guy gets a call from this guy, Wilcox, who says that, I heard you have a problem up there. Well, I have something to tell you. When we get that night, Jesse is talking to Elvis, asking him, did my mom ever talk about me? Did she ever talk about my dad? And did she ever say anything? And each question, Elvis says, no, no, no. But then Elvis says, she had a lot of problems. She lied a lot. She said she'd always be here, that she'd never leave. And Elvis starts crying. Because obviously, he lost his mom too at the same time. So I guess it finally caught up with him in that moment. But the next morning, Randolph wakes them up and says that Luna's beached herself again. And they need to try something else. So Randolph and Jesse head out to find herbs, plants, and other Indian medicine, basically. Native American medicine that Randolph is teaching Jesse about at that moment. And Elvis has stayed behind to try and help Annie and Glenn get Luna back in the water. But basically Glenn and Annie wanted to stay away. And Annie actually says, Elvis, just stay back. It's dangerous. Just go. And Elvis does exactly that. He takes his stuff, puts it in a duffel, and he takes Glenn's wallet. And he runs away. He tries to catch the ferry that day to get back to the mainland, but he's just a little too late. They shut the gate and they tell him the next ferry won't be there until the next morning, so he's still stuck there. And he hides in a boat where he goes to sleep for the night. Although we do see him crying because he opens the wallet for a picture that shows a picture of Jesse, Glenn, and Annie smiling. He just kind of cries himself to sleep. In the meantime, Glenn and Annie, they realize what happened. She tells Glenn about the spit shake, and he's like, yeah, that's pretty serious. Jesse and Randolph are on that floating dock again, that wooden floating dock, and they are they're getting Willy, Little Spot, and Luna to come to them. And they get Luna to open her mouth, where Randolph takes this very big leaf and uses it as a scoop and puts this medicine in Luna's mouth, on her tongue, on the top of her mouth. And then he starts chanting this, I think it's an Indian chant, a Haida chant. And the whales start going along with it. Even Luna, very, very weakly, which is pretty powerful. And the next morning, Luna's doing a lot better. Like, she's still a little bit slower than her brothers in the swimming, but she's doing a lot better. And Kate says, it's great. Randolph says, yeah, pretty powerful stuff in my medicine. And she's like, your medicine? What did you do behind my back, Randolph? He's like, nothing. And she's like, well, whatever you did, I'm glad you did it. So, Elvis goes into this cafe, this donut shop. He gets a coffee and a jelly donut. And then he overhears this conversation between this guy, Wilcox, and the oil guy, talking about the 3 orcas. Wilcox is like, we haven't taken an orca out of the wild in 20 years. Now there's 3 right in my hands. And he says that we're going to give you $1 million for each of for the 2 little ones, and $2 million for the big brother, because he's already trained. And the oil guy's like, listen, I just want it to look like we have their best interests at heart. And Wilcox is like, yeah, and your 10%. Wilcox says, while they're getting better, no reason why people can't pay to see them. So 10% of that revenue. And Elvis, he has this ticket for the ferry, but he tears it up, and he starts doing the thumb thing to get a ride. And the Coast Guard, or the, I guess the Coastal Patrol, whatever it's called, on the island, they are putting up these nets and these booms, floating part of the net, so they can keep the oil out, because it's getting closer. The wind is pushing it to the cove. And the oil executive announces that they're going to take the 3 whales out of the cove and put them in, take them to basically aquariums, I guess you could say, and start treating them so they can recuperate. And Elvis shows up to Jesse and Nadine, and he says, listen, I heard everything about this. You have to trust me. And Jesse's like, why should I trust you? And Elvis says, because nobody ever has. And I guess Jesse does trust him in that moment, because him, Nadine, and Elvis run to the dock where the oil guy is. And Jesse says, you're a liar. You're not going to help these whales. You're going to give them to an aquarium. And obviously there's this look between the 2 oil guys like, wait, what? Then he knows. And the oil guy says, you're going to have to leave now, kids. And Jesse says, you're not going to get away with this. And we see how this Wilcox guy and his crew have gotten Little Spot into one of the harnesses to lift him up out of the water. And you hear the distress in his voice. And then you hear Willy doing the same thing. And the oil guy just turns around and says, I want these kids out of here now. And Jesse says, you promised, and shoves the guy straight into the water. And the other oil guy's like, John, give me your hand, give me your hand. And Elvis is like, you jerk, and then karate kicks him into the water. The oil guy comes up and says, where are those kids? And Jesse, Nadine, and Elvis watch as Willy decides to take matters into his own hands, and he comes up from the water and knocks over Wilcox's boat that's holding Little Spot by rope on the harness, and the harness comes down, Little Spot's free, while the other guys fall in the water, of course. And then Jesse gets him and Nadine head towards, they get in Glenn's boat, the small boat that Jesse was working with Glenn on. And Elvis goes to another boat, and he does something to it, but we don't see what. And then they pick Elvis up, they get him into a life jacket, and they start going towards the whales to get them out of the cove. And these rough-looking characters, which is part of Wilcox's crew, I guess, they grab this other boat that Elvis was on, and they try to go after them. But little do they know that the anchor was left out of the boat, and it catches on the dock and holds the boat. It stops them in their tracks, and 2 of the guys go flying over the boat into the water. So their boat's useless at that moment because they're stuck. And I think they blew the engine too. And Elvis is like, yeah, I did that. Yep, good job. And so Jesse brings Willy to the surface with the old water thing. And he does he says, Willy, we're going to get you out of here. Remember this? Good. Let's do it. You got to break that boom. And so Willy does exactly that. He comes up, jumps. We hear that music from the original movie, and he comes down on the boom, breaking it and making the nets fall through the water. And so Willy, Luna, and Little Spot are free. They head out. Jessie and the others follow them to make sure they make it past the oil. Unfortunately, while all this has been going on, engineers and electricians have been trying to get the oil tanker to fix the engine. They've been trying to fix it so they might be able to stop, to at least get the boat, to get the ship out of there. Unfortunately, a fire started, and then there's an explosion on board the ship that sets the oil on fire. So there's fire all over the water. And when they see this, Willy, Luna, and Little Spot go under, and they swim free. But Jessie, Nadine, and Elvis try to turn into this cove so they can go around and make a U-turn, but they hit a rock, a very, very big rock that puts a hole in the hull. And so they start taking on water. They're trying to get to the inside of the cove so they can climb out, but the rocks are too steep. So they turn around because they see an opening in the fire that they might be able to get through, but they're a little too slow. They just miss it. And they see this helicopter coming down because Randolph has called in a helicopter to help rescue them from the Coast Guard. He's on his ship, Natslane, along with Glenn and Annie. But the helicopter does get to them. Elvis has put his hands in the water and pulled it out, and his hands are covered in oil. So he's like, get me out of this, Jessie. I swear I'll never hurt you again. Please get me out of this. And the helicopter does show up. They lower this harness down, and you put your arms through it, and you hold on tight. And Nadine and Elvis are wearing life vests. Jessie isn't. I'm guessing there wasn't a third one. And they pull Elvis up as he's saying as Jessie's telling him, it's just like bungee jumping. And Elvis says, I didn't go bungee jumping. I lied. As he's being pulled up. And they get Elvis in. Nadine is next. She gets up. She's obviously very, very scared. And Jessie is, finally the boat has completely sunk into the water. It's gone. And Jessie's in the water now. And he's like, give me the harness, help, help. And he does grab it. They pull him up. But unfortunately, the smoke is killing the engine of the helicopter. So they have to pull away while he's on the harness. And just before they can get him in, Jessie slips out of the harness. And he falls into the water from a great height. So he hits the water with a loud bam. And they see him come up, and he's breathing and everything. But then the pilot says, we have to get out of here. And so the helicopter leaves. But Jessie starts sinking. And then Willy comes to the rescue. Willy gets them up to the surface to take a breath. And they approach the fire. The oil that's on fire. And Jessie takes as deep a breath as he can as Willy dives under. And they do finally surface right next to Natslane, the boat, with Randolph, Annie, and Glenn. And they see Jessie, and they grab him, they give him a hug, they get him on the boat, they thank Willy. And Jessie's like, I'm okay, boy, don't worry. But Willy's not leaving. And Randolph does this. He's telling Jessie, you need to tell him to go. Because he just saved your life after you saved his. You need to tell him to go. So Jessie does exactly that. He says, bye. See you later, Willy. And after Willy leaves, that's when the Coast Guard boat shows up with Elvis and Nadine on it. And Elvis apologizes and gives Jessie a picture of Elvis, Jessie's mom, that's been ripped. But Elvis says, I taped it up as best I could. She talked about you all the time. She felt bad about what happened. And then Elvis asks, what happened to Little Spot, Willy and Luna? And Jessie says, they're back with their mom now. How can you be sure? Jessie grabs the necklace. I know. And then, just like in the original movie, Jessie starts saying, Sanana Hayun Hiatus. Sanana Hayun Hiatus. And it goes to a scene of all these orcas jumping out of the water and splashing and playing. And then we see Willy, Luna, and Little Spot reunited with their mom. And that's where we get the end credits. But I think a strong sequel movie. I think it was good. Not as strong as the first, obviously, but still good. Now, throughout this movie, the one thing we don't see for sure, they do a really good job with this. I had no idea this happened in the beginning. But they did not use any orcas. They used animatronics instead. And I had no idea when I was younger. No idea. I didn't believe my sister when she told me they're not real. I didn't believe it. But it's absolutely true. Not a single whale was used in this movie. So that was pretty cool that they were able to get me like that, which I like. So I think it's a fantastic family movie. I think it's a good kids movie. They did a very good job. So that ends my review for Free Willy 2, The Adventure Home. I hope that I'll be able to do the third one very soon. So thank you again, and Charlie Black 20, out.